I'm really excited to talk to you guys today how you can produce strong AWS security signals from CloudTrail. So real quick before we get into the details, I just wanted to provide a little background about who I am and who Expel is and what we do. So I'm on our detection and response team at Expel. Expel is a transparent security operations as a service. So we've built what we call our Expel Workbench platform. And this platform does a couple cool things for us. For one, it allows us to hook into the security technologies that our customers have invested in and essentially use that as a source of signal and unify all that data and put that in front of our security analysts for review. Two, it also allows us to essentially scale with the needs of our customers and grow as they grow with them. One kind of key tenet of what Expel does, one thing that we like to think we do a little bit differently from the rest is we want to focus on really driving to finding answers and improving the security posture of our customers. So we don't essentially want to be just throwing alerts over a fence and creating more work for customers, but we want to be actually driving to the root cause during the course of an investigation and understanding what recommendations we can make to actually improve the security posture of our customers. So how does this all work behind the scenes? Whoa. That was quick. Sorry about that. So I just wanted to give you kind of a quick sneak peek of what the Expel platform looks like behind the scenes. So I mentioned we developed our platform from the get-go to scale with customer need. So from the start, we've embraced technologies like Kubernetes, like Kafka, like Elastic to help us grow as our customers grow. And from the beginning, Sumo has been part of our strategy. We're actually kind of in a unique position with Sumo Logic. We're both a customer and a partner, if you can wrap your heads around that. So on the customer side, we actually leverage Sumo Logic internally. You can imagine as we need to hook up to all kinds of sources of signal from all kinds of security technologies, and our analysts have to be able to quickly search and analyze and make sense of all that information. We need a platform that allows us to quickly and easily do that. And Sumo Logic has been great for that, for our operations team. But on the partner side, we actually also have developed an integration with Sumo Logic, their web APIs. And what that allows us to do is for our customers who have Sumo Logic, we can leverage that as a data store and pull data for detection and investigation purposes. So let's talk about AWS now that we've kind of set the stage for who Expel is and what we do. We have a unique perspective being a security services provider, right? We work with organizations of all kinds of shapes and sizes, from single account, low volume AWS accounts to like giant organizations, multiple accounts, multiple regions. And via working with all these accounts, we get exposure to kind of the common challenges that people face when they're trying to get a handle on monitoring those environments. Those challenges include, just understanding generally like what sources of signal exist in AWS, like what should you actually consume, what should you care about, getting that data flowing, so understanding how to collect it and make it available and searching across it, and then potentially most importantly and most difficult, like actually getting value out of that data, putting that data to use to actually drive business value. So to kind of dive a little bit deeper into that first challenge, just generally understanding sources of signal, and to step back, like AWS can be kind of a little bit of an obstacle for security teams that are used to monitoring traditional enterprises, right? It's a completely new technology platform. The data is unfamiliar to many of us, so there's definitely a ramp-up period getting used to all these services and making sense of it. And one of those challenges is just understanding the various sources of signal and the various data that you can get out of your AWS platform. So at Expel, we like to think about the sources of signal in these three categories. So starting from the bottom here, we like to categorize CloudTrail into a bucket we call control plane activity. So think of this as like system events, right? Activity that's occurring in the actual AWS platform, like people logging in, interacting with IAM users or various services. Every time anything that's happening in the AWS platform, that gets logged via the CloudTrail service. So on top of that, we have a layer of signal we call essentially security signal. So if you're subscribing or paying for a service like GuardDuty, right, that's an additional source of signal that's looking at like VPC flow logs, network data to surface anomalies on top of what you would get from CloudTrail. Or maybe you're also using a service like Macy that's kind of trying to tackle the data protection side of things. So this is kind of another category of data that we generally bucket as security signal. And then finally, we think about application data, right? Everybody's workload is going to be different depending what you're running in AWS, and it's going to produce its own very unique signal. So understanding what that signal looks like and what the use cases are in terms of detection and response is important as well. But for this talk in particular, I wanted to focus in on CloudTrail, and there's a reason for that. Like CloudTrail is very generally applicable, right? It exists in every AWS environment, and actually there's a gold mine of opportunity, in my opinion, for detection and investigation. And I think in many cases it's underutilized. When organizations stand up an AWS account, generally the first thing you do is turn on CloudTrail, but rarely do I find organizations have really thought through all the use cases and actually implemented and are really getting all the value they can out of that source. So I wanted to dive into that a little bit deeper and kind of talk about what we've found value in and potentially, hopefully, inspire you and give you some ideas that you can take back and potentially implement in your own organization. So before we get there, we need to talk about how to get data flowing, and I think we're all sort of generally familiar with Sumo Logic here, and we're lucky in that Sumo Logic makes this very easy for us. We don't have to do too much manual labor at all to actually start consuming and processing CloudTrail data from AWS. On the AWS side, it's easy as well. In a couple clicks, you can create a global trail and enforce that across all of your sub-accounts. That's actually really important. So it wasn't always the case, but one old pain point was, you would have to actually manually consume and consolidate all your CloudTrail from all your various accounts manually into some sort of S3 bucket and kind of keep track of that. Now with AWS organizations, you can actually enforce that across all of your sub-accounts, and that just prevents you from getting into a sticky situation later where maybe you're mid-incident and you realize, hey, we actually didn't turn on CloudTrail for this one sub-account or this one region. And that's kind of a worst-case scenario, right? So doing this at the master account level and enforcing this across all of your AWS sub-accounts is really an awesome feature that we encourage people to take advantage of. And once you've done that on the AWS side, hooking that up to Sumo Logic is really simple as well. You can do this in the user interface. With a couple clicks, you can consume data from that central S3 bucket just by giving Sumo Logic the permissions it needs to read those objects from that bucket. So it might be kind of tempting to claim success here and move on, right? Like we've hooked up a data pipeline, the data is available to us, we can search it when we need it. Aren't we done? But really, our job really isn't done here at all, right? Like we need to actually follow through and make sure we're getting the value out of that data that we could. So how do we start that process? Where to begin? It's kind of overwhelming, right? So if you come from security organization, you're probably familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework. The security community relies on it pretty heavily. It's a way of categorizing attacker behaviors, essentially thinking about attacks in terms of the attack life cycle. So like, how's an attacker going to gain initial access to my environment? What are the various techniques and behaviors we might observe? How will they actually discover and enumerate an environment once they've gained access? How will they persist in the environment? All the way through, completing their mission, exfiltrating data, and so on and so forth. And this is a really useful tool and framework that we rely pretty heavily on nowadays for thinking about how to protect our traditional enterprises. It's particularly useful for thinking about protecting Windows environments, Mac, Linux. There's even an attack framework now for mobile devices, which is fantastic. But unfortunately, I think we're still learning as a security community about cloud platforms like AWS and Azure and GCP. There isn't a whole lot of subject matter expertise out there, not a whole lot of documentation out there that documents attacker behaviors and what they look like when they're targeting your cloud infrastructure. That being said, I think it's still actually really valuable to think about the attack lifecycle and how it applies to your cloud platform. Because as you go through that thought exercise and you think about, for example, how could an attacker gain access to my AWS environment? If they did gain access, what are the things that they would do after that? Where are my valuable resources, and what do I need to protect? That's a really useful thought exercise. And as you apply the kind of fundamentals of the MITRE ATT&CK framework to your cloud platform, I think a lot of really interesting detection use cases come out of that. So kind of using that as a starting point, I wanted to walk through some real-world examples of things that we've found value in and potentially maybe some things that you could try out in your own environment. I wanted to provide some examples you guys can take back and try it on your own. So, I mentioned the attack framework, so kind of following through that attack lifecycle, like let's think about some of those categories and some of those attacker behaviors and how they might apply to an AWS environment. So I mentioned initial access. So how is an attacker going to be able to get into your, gain initial access to your AWS environment? You may think about, for example, okay, well, where are my access keys? Where do those live? Do I have them on developer workstations? Are they in any repositories? What about my CI/CD pipeline? Where do those access keys exist? And how might an attacker gain access to those and leverage those? And what would it look like if they did? You might think about IAM roles, so what other accounts are we trusting? What other services are we trusting? You might think about what are my external points of presence? What can people hit publicly, and how could they route from that endpoint to an internal network? So thinking about suspicious logins in particular, unfortunately, compromised credentials are still a problem for AWS and all cloud platforms today. It's a low-hanging fruit for attackers if they can get access to a developer's workstation, or they get lucky and find access keys on a repository. That's an easy way to gain access to an account. So what does this look for, this query? We're lucky in this case that CloudTrail records pretty rich information when users log in and interact with AWS services. So when somebody logs into the console, for example, you get their source IP address, you get their user agent string, you get whether or not they use multi-factor authentication. We can use, additionally, Sumo Logic's geolocation lookup feature to see what country, what longitude, latitude did they come from. And we can combine all of these kind of features together and make a determination as to is this something that's normal for this user, for my organization, or is it not? Is this something I need to surface? And this is something that's obviously going to be customizable based on what's normal for your environment. And it's pretty straightforward, but you'll be surprised to see what kind of stuff falls out of a detection like this. In this case, we're looking for, this query is looking for console logins where the user didn't use multi-factor authentication, and they're not coming from a country that you would expect. And you can fine-tune that to your organization based on what's normal as well. Just general tips and tricks as well. You got to think about, when I see this activity, what are the follow-on questions? How do I actually investigate this? So at Expel, we think of these as investigative playbooks, investigative questions. So questions like, well, where does this user normally authenticate from? What device are they normally using? Do they normally use multi-factor authentication? And then what happened after they logged in? Is that normal as well? Looking for things like get caller identity, which is essentially like a who am I call in AWS, can be interesting as well, just as an indicator that something suspicious might be going on. So, let's assume that for a second that an attacker does have compromised credentials and they did gain initial access to your AWS environment. What do the follow-on activities look like? So we're kind of progressing through the attack framework, through the attack lifecycle to the next phase. So typically what happens next is an attacker needs to learn about that environment, right? They don't know what you know. They don't know how your environment works. They don't know what resources exist, what permissions they have. So they need to discover that. And they're going to do that by enumerating. There are tools out there they can use to do this. They could poke around in the AWS console, but the end result is they're going to be poking around, interacting with various AWS services with the credentials that they have to try to see what they have access to, what exists, what might be interesting to them based on whatever their goals are. So there are some really interesting things that we can look for on the defensive side to try to clue ourselves into the fact that this might be happening, right? One side effect of an attacker doing this is they're going to trip over themselves a little bit, right? They don't know what permissions they have. They don't know what exists, and whatnot. So as they poke around, they're going to generate API failures when policies deny, them from doing the things they want to. So in this case, what this query is looking for is it's looking for a burst in access denied failures for a user count, and it's specifically looking for a situation where a user is failing more than 5 times for more than one unique method and interacting with more than one unique AWS service. That's important as well. Using aggregation here on the Sumo Logic end really helps to eliminate false positives. Things like a user failing with the same API call over and over and over is actually less interesting than a user trying to enumerate across multiple services and trying multiple different things but getting blocked. One thing, as you fine-tune this type of detection in your environment, one thing that pretty quickly falls out is a lot of misconfigured services. Configuration scanning services are a big, kind of noisy here as well. So it's an opportunity to review policy documents and actually fix some of those broken services that you may not know are broken in your environment. So kind of continuing along the attack lifecycle here, another goal an attacker has once they have access to your environment is, ensuring that they maintain that access. If you put on your attacker hat for a second and you spend a lot of time and effort potentially, gaining access to an environment, you don't want to, lose it overnight, right? You want to be able to persist in that environment and lie low until you are able to accomplish your mission. So the MITRE ATT&CK framework calls this maintaining access or persistence. If you think about traditional enterprises in a Windows environment, for example, like an attacker might do something like create a service account, create a scheduled task, something like that. But what does that look like in an AWS platform? What does persistence look like in a cloud platform? So I have to do a big shout out here to the team over at Rhino Security Labs. If you guys haven't heard of those guys, go check out their blog. They're doing a lot of really cool research in this area in particular. They've been working on a tool called PackU that essentially illustrates a lot of these attacker behaviors and lets you try them out on your own and see what it looks like in your environment. One particular persistence mechanism they've done a lot of cool research around is using Lambda as a way to persist in an environment. So imagine a Lambda function where every time you create a new IAM user, a backdoor access key is automatically added, kind of invisibly behind the scenes. Or every time you create a new IAM role, the trust policy is automatically updated by that function. Or every time you add or modify a security group, it automatically adds authorized inbound access from an IP address of their choosing. So kind of really interesting stuff, and it's kind of interesting to see the parallels between traditional enterprises and what's happening in AWS platforms. So this query is looking for those kinds of events coming from a Lambda function, things like creating an access key, modifying a security group, updating assume role policy, and this, in our testing, has been a really high fidelity indicator. This almost never happens for legitimate reasons, so it's just kind of interesting to look for in your environment. So we'll put our attacker hat on one last time here for this last example. Again, you want to maintain access. You also want to evade detection for as long as possible, right? You don't want to be found out. So what are the ways that an attacker might do that in an AWS environment? We've been talking so far about how useful CloudTrail can be and logging in general can be to kind of clue us into the presence of an attacker in your environment. And that makes those services, those logging services like CloudTrail and CloudWatch, a target for an attacker as well. They want to disable and disrupt that logging if they can to prevent from being found. So luckily they can't turn everything off, and we can leverage what they can't turn off to find them do this. So for example, every AWS account has the event history. That's a 90-day window of CloudTrail records per region that an attacker can't turn off. And going back to the initial recommendation, if you're using AWS organizations to enforce a master CloudTrail, if there's a compromise in one of your sub-accounts, there's no way that global CloudTrail can be disabled, which is a nice bonus as well. So in this case, for this query, we're looking for evidence that somebody's trying to turn off logging or disrupt logging in your environment, potentially trying to evade detection. Okay, so again, it's kind of tempting right now to claim success and move on, right? Like we've set up a data pipeline, we've got a bunch of awesome data to play with and use for detection and investigation. But we'd be dropping the ball if we didn't think about what happens to those alerts after they're generated, right? Who's going to be responsible for looking at them? What's the process? And how do we make sure that that's consistent? So you want to think about how you want to consume alerts. This just depends on your organization, right? You may have a central security team that's responsible for initial triage and then escalating out to various developer teams, for example. Or you may just send alerts directly to owning teams, or you may involve a third party or a partner like Expel to do initial triage and then only tell you or engage you when you need to do something. So just understanding that flow and making those decisions and defining what's the SLA, who's responsible, what's the process, and then establishing a feedback loop for improvement as well is important. It's tempting again to develop a detection and just try to set it and forget it, but those of us that have been living in kind of security operations know that it's a constant process of fine-tuning detections to make sure that you're not either too sensitive or not sensitive enough, just based on what's normal in your environment. So kind of just bringing this all together again, this all boils down to how can you more effectively manage risk in AWS? And I think CloudTrail in general is a really great place to start. There's a gold mine of data available to you It's very easy to get up and running with Sumo logic and start brainstorming and implementing detection use cases like the few examples that we've talked about here. That's really just the tip of the iceberg. And establishing that feedback loop to continuously improve as well. We've been embracing cloud platforms at Expel to make sure that we can grow to satisfy our customer need. Historically, it's kind of the nightmare of security teams to move too fast and have to play catch up with the business. But leveraging technology like Sumo logic to make a lot of this easier and quicker and focus on what's important to us makes it a lot more palatable, and we can accomplish our security objectives without slowing down the business. So that's pretty much it. So I don't think we have too much time left, but check out our blog. All this stuff, if you wanted to screen capture the slides, the same stuff's up on the blog as well. So I'll hang out over here and at our booth for questions if you guys want to stop by.
We have a couple of minutes. So if people have questions, I have a microphone. Happy to any questions. If not,
how do you deal with chain of attacks in the cloud? Like, you probably are showing it one event at a time where you're interested in one particular event. But if it's something where this led to this, this led to this, this led to this, how would you think about chaining those kind of attacks?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear like the first half. It cut in halfway through. Can you repeat the question?
So how would you chain the attack? Like, for example, if the attacker comes into your application and he somehow got access to, let's say, one wall, and then he goes to some AWS credential on your box and then goes onto the cloud and destroys your logs and stuff like that and does even more things after that. So how would you be interested in chaining these kind of things?
Chaining these things. Yeah, that's a really good point. Our perspective has always been you need a layered approach, right? You can never rely on a single point of failure for a detection strategy. You want to have good detection on your endpoints, good detection on the network, and then good detection in your cloud platforms, and be able to follow the attacker across that life cycle wherever they're pivoting to. Some areas are more difficult than others, like visibility is challenging, like on the network in AWS, for example. Sometimes it's difficult to get good visibility into like your CI/CD pipeline and things like that. There are always going to be some blind spots, which is why it's important to have that layered approach, so that even if one piece or one step of your detection approach fails, you have some other overlapping things that will hopefully clue you into what's going on. Does that help?
Great. I think we are just about out of time. Please join me in thank you, Dan, for this very helpful presentation.
Thank you.